Hello friends, welcome to my YouTube channel Best Audiobooks of All Time. If you like the content of this video, please share, subscribe, hit the bell icon and like. The Honjin Murders by Seishi Yokomizo. Chapter 5. A New Use for a Koto Pick. The father of F, the man who provided me with the background information for my story, used to be the village doctor. He is now sadly departed, but the morning after the murder, it was Dr. F who was the first to arrive on the scene. The doctor appears to have been fascinated by the Honjin murder case and made detailed notes which I am still able to consult today. Much of this story has been recreated from the content of those notes. Among them was a sketch of the scene in and around the annex house. When writing a book of this kind, such materials are extremely helpful for keeping track of what occurred, so I am going to include the manuscript sketch. It was about 6 o'clock and the sun was starting to come up by the time Dr. F and the local police constable arrived. As soon as the constable saw the scene of the crime, he called the main police station in S-Town to report a major incident. The S-Town police station in turn called the prefectural police headquarters. So, police investigators kept turning up, each more senior than the last. The location was so remote that it was reportedly already noon by the time everyone was assembled. The investigators must have conducted a crime scene investigation and interviewed everyone connected to the victims, but it surely isn't necessary to cover all that in detail here. I really don't want to bore my readers, so I will just summarize for you the findings of the chief investigator, Detective Inspector Isukawa. Plan of the Ichanagi Annex House. First, there was the problem of the footprints. Inspector Isukawa arrived around 11 that morning, but by then the snow had already begun to melt. There was no reason to doubt Ginzo's Roisuke's and the servant Genshichi's testimonies that there hadn't been a single footprint in the snow. This information caused the inspector great anxiety, but in fact it wasn't quite true that there were no footprints whatsoever. I invite you to take another look at the sketch of the annex house. There's a steep hillside or a kind of cliff edge to the north of the building. Between this cliff and the annex there's a strip of empty land about 6 feet wide. The cliff top is thick with bamboo trees that hang out over the edge, with the result that the snow didn't pile up directly below the cliff that night. It was in this empty area close to the east end of the annex that there were some visibly muddy footprints. And not only footprints, according to the police, there were also signs that somebody had slid down the side of the cliff into the grounds. As you can see on the sketch, the footprints head towards the east entrance to the building. But once they get close, they disappear, presumably because they were covered by a layer of snow. But then, on the eastern floor of the Genkan entranceway, where shoes are removed before stepping up into the house, there were 2 more muddy footprints that appeared to be identical to the others. In summary, whoever had slid down the side of the cliff had then walked east and entered the annex house by its front door. Those footprints were strangely misshapen. There was an extremely deep impression at the door and a much lighter, twisted one at the heel. It was clear to anyone that they had been made by a pair of old, worn-out shoes. There was nobody in the Ichanagi household who owned a pair of shoes like that. Thus, it was reasonable to assume that the footprints belonged to the murderer. In other words, the murderer had come sliding down the cliff behind the annex house and had crept in through the main entrance. But what time could this have happened? Well, the snow was very useful in working this out. The snow had started falling around 9 o'clock the previous evening and had stopped at around 3 in the morning. This meant that the murderer had snuck into the house before 9, or at least before it began to snow heavily around 2 a.m. However, the footprints inside the gin can didn't seem to have been made by shoes that had trodden in snow. So the conclusion was that they had been made before 9 p.m. Additionally, according to Akiko, who had walked around the Engawa at around 7 p.m. to close all the rain shutters, there hadn't been any footprints inside the gin can at that time. It was decided that the killer must have crept in between 7 and 9 p.m., most likely while the wedding ceremony was underway in the main house. So far, this all seemed to make sense. But what did the murderer do after sneaking into the house? Again, please take a look at the sketch. There's a little storage closet just opposite the toilet. It is believed that the murderer hid in there. This particular closet was filled with discarded bedding and some cotton filling that had been removed from old futons. There were clear imprints left in the cotton bedding that indicated somebody had been lying there. Not only that, but the scabbard of a katana, presumably the one that had been used as the murder weapon, was lying on the closet floor. This sword belonged to the Ichanagi family and had been on display on a shelf in the tokonoma of the larger room earlier that day. The killer must have taken it into the closet with him. This means that during the sake ceremony, the katana was already missing, but nobody noticed, probably because the folding screen had been placed in front of the alcove. It seems strange, though, that the killer waited until 4 a.m. to commit the murder. After all, the bride and groom had gone to bed around 2 a.m. There were many theories about this, but the most persuasive argued that since it was their wedding night, Kenzo and Katsuko were probably not in a hurry to go to sleep, and the killer wanted to wait for them to drop off before attacking. Well, this was the most accepted theory, but I'd like you to take one more look at the location of that closet. Between that closet and the larger tatami room where the newlyweds were sleeping, there is only a single wall. The murderer must have been able to hear everything, feel everything that passed between them. Every whisper, every breath, every sigh. This was the most nauseating aspect of this case. When Ginzo heard it from the police detectives, his face turned dark with anger and disgust. Having waited until the couple fell asleep, the killer ventured out of the closet, blade drawn. He would have opened the shoji sliding doors that separated the west side corridor from the tatami rooms and entered the bedroom area. But before that, he did something a little strange, or so it seems. The shoji door closest to the tokonoma alcove had been left open just a crack. After Katsuko finished her Koto performance, Akiko of the branch family reported having placed the box containing the Koto pics in the back right hand corner of the tokonoma. But when the crime scene was discovered, the box of pics was found in front of the left corner, right by the small opening in the shoji. The killer had evidently slid the door open a little, reached in through the opening and picked up the box. Then he had removed 3 Koto pics from it, slipped them onto his fingers and put the box back in a different location. The police came to this conclusion after examining the bloody 3-fingered handprint on the gold leaf byobo screen. I mentioned at the end of the previous chapter that there was something bizarre about this footprint and handprint, and now I can reveal that there were no prints at all left by the fingers, just scratch marks left by Koto pics. Perhaps this would be the right moment to remind you of the nature of koto picks. Unlike other kinds of musical picks or plectrums, the koto pick resembles a false fingernail attached to a ring. The ring slips over the finger with the nail part covering the pad of the finger. In other words, if you were wearing koto picks, your fingerprints would be obscured. Knowing this, the killer had slipped koto picks onto his fingers before committing the murders, and so the police believed. As the 3 missing koto picks were found covered in blood on the shelf above the hand basin in the lavatory area, it seems to have been a reasonable conclusion. So the killer, with 3 koto picks on his hand and brandishing a katana, crept into the room where the newlyweds were sleeping. First, he attacked Katsuko, who was sleeping on the side nearer the entrance, slashing her several times. There was evidence that Katsuko had struggled briefly, but with no great force. It seemed the blade of the sword had killed her almost immediately. No doubt, woken by the voice, Kenzo had sat up only to be cut down by the killer with a blow that sliced open his arm. Undaunted, he had then thrown himself on top of Katsuko's body to protect her, at which the killer ran him through with the katana, leaving the bridegroom's body pierced straight through the heart, lying lifeless on top of his bride. This was the scenario that Inspector Isukawa constructed in his mind, but there was a lot more that he didn't understand. I've already mentioned that the koto had been brought to the bedside and appeared to have been played with bloody fingers. But why on earth had the murderer paused his attack to play a musical instrument? And then there was the bridge from under the broken string. Why was that missing, and where had it gone? The investigators had searched the whole annex building, but it was nowhere to be found. However, even more mysterious was the disappearance of the killer himself. How had he escaped? Every single door or window of the building had been sturdily locked from inside. There was not a single opening through which anyone, man or woman, could have squeezed. And yet someone had killed Kenzo and Katsuko, and after playing the koto had apparently gone out through the shoji doors on the west side and onto the Engawa. He had left the 3 bloody koto picks above the hand basin, and just inside the Amado rain shutter that Yosuke and Genshichi had broken with the axe, he had dropped a small hand towel, crumpled into a blood-smeared ball. But that wasn't all. On the inside of the smashed rain shutter itself was a bloody handprint with only 3 fingers. But this time, the fingers were not covered by koto picks. The prints were faint but visible. This piece of evidence suggested that the killer had made his escape through the rain shutters, or at the very least had tried to open them. The question was, had the shutter really been bolted shut before Genshichi had broken it with the axe? Ryosuke was the one who had reached inside and unlocked it, and he didn't take too kindly to suggestions that he might have been mistaken. The rain shutter was definitely bolted shut. Genshichi smashed a hole in it with the axe, just big enough for me to put a hand inside, reach in and slide the bolt. It's absurd to even suggest that the murderer could have escaped that way. And even if he did, how come there were no footprints out there in the snow? Genshichi and I are absolutely sure of that. Genzo-san will back us up too. Genzo nodded his agreement, but at the same time he fixed Ryosuke's face with eyes that held more than a hint of suspicion. But let's back up for a moment. Before dawn had broken that morning, Genzo was standing with Ryosuke, staring in horror at the bodies of his niece and her husband. When the police began to arrive, Genzo was finally able to tear himself away. It was around 7 a.m. and the weather had cleared up. The snow piled high on the roof of the main building was dazzling in the morning sun. The dripping of the meltwater from the eaves of the house was becoming faster and faster. But Genzo was blind to the sight and deaf to the sound. His face was twisted in sorrow, and concealed deep beneath that sorrow was a deep sense of regret and anger. Wordlessly, he started back towards the main house, but was interrupted by the arrival of Saburo. He had stayed the night at great uncle Ihei's house in K, but now, having got word from a servant about what had happened, he had hurried home. He looked pale, but it was his companion who caught Genso's attention, an elegant mustached gentleman in his mid-30s. When the mistress of the house caught sight of him, she looked astonished. "Oh, Ruji, what are you doing here? Mother Genshichi just told me the dreadful news." Of course, he seemed upset, at the same time calmer than expected under the circumstances. "It's horrible, dreadful. I don't know what to do. But Ruji, how are you here so quickly? When did you get back?" "I just arrived from Fukuoka. The conference I was attending finished earlier than expected. I thought I would come to offer Kenzo my congratulations. I got off at N station and had just stopped by great uncle Ihei's house in K to ask how the wedding had gone when Genshichi arrived." Ginzo had been watching the young man with great distrust, but as he heard these words, his eyes grew wider until his gaze was practically burning a hole in the side of Ruji's face. The stare was so intense that Ruji himself could hardly fail to notice it. He began to look uncomfortable. Mother, this man. Oh, this is Katsuko's uncle, Ginzo-san. This is my second son, Ruji." Ginzo inclined his head and without uttering a single word returned to his room in the main house. For a while he just stood there thinking, but eventually he uttered a single sentence. "That man's lying." With that he opened his suitcase and took out a blank telegram. After a few moments he began to write, "Katsuko dead, Sen Kindaichi." He addressed it to his own wife, then set out for the K-Town post office. End of chapter 5. If you like the content of this video, please share, subscribe, hit the bell icon and like.